Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host for today, Jess, and we're today talking about the politics of law enforcement and its impacts on democracy. Our guest is Michelle Phelps, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Her work focuses on the sociology of punishment, and she is the author of 2 books, the latest of which is titled The Minneapolis Reckoning: Race, Violence and the Politics of Policing in America. Michelle, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So we always start with the first question. So in your opinion, what is the single biggest problem with democracy?
I think there's a lot of ways to answer this question, and it's hard to kind of boil it down. But if I had to pick one kind of meta commentary about the challenges with democracy today, thinking about my own work, it would be the short political attention span we have for addressing complex policy problems. We can think about public safety as a complex policy problem, immigration reform, and these are the kinds of policy challenges that require deep thought and investment, coordination, and care. And instead, what we often get are these cheap fixes, scapegoats, and public stunts. And as a result, declining public trust as we continue to leave these challenges unresolved and in some cases make things worse.
Amazing, thanks. And I think that's a great introduction into your work then. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with your work, it's broadly focused on the sociology of punishment, as I said, with a focus on punitive approaches in the US in their policing departments, probation and prisons. So could you say a little bit more about the trajectory of your work so far?
Sure. So I stumbled into this work somewhat by accident. I was actually a psychology undergrad in college, and I saw a flyer that was about a tutoring program at a prison. So I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and it's just happens to be geographically near San Quentin Prison in California, which is a particularly weird prison because it's on this like beautiful bayfront land. So it's this very dilapidated building that is on this just stunning property, but it's within commuting distance of the Bay Area. And so, I just, I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And I just signed up, and I really just fell headfirst into the field. And what really struck me immediately actually was just how much my peers in college took for granted their education. I would go to these lectures and I would see some of my fellow students in, pajamas and messing around and not paying attention to their lectures and just sort of taking it for granted and blowing it off. And then I would go into the prison, and the men there were just so incredibly grateful for the volunteers. And I have this very vivid memory of a man I was working with who wanted to write an essay, and we were working on the 5-paragraph essay structure, which was, just something I had learned in high school and hadn't thought much about. And it was so transformational for him because he had a lot he wanted to express, and being able to become a stronger writer was this really empowering moment for him. And so they were so incredibly locked into this education as a transformative moment. And that was in large part because of the deprivation they were experiencing inside of prison, that this moment of the tutoring program was really distinct from their day-to-day life in the prisons. And I started reading about punishment and really just never stopped. And, in some ways, if you go into our country's prisons, it is like going into another world. It is a part of our democracy that we wall off, literally, and a place where there are just profound injustices every day in our system. And that interest in prisons, eventually I started broadening out to think about all of the ways that we punish unequally outside of institutions, right? So what does it look like in policing? What does it look like in probation, which is a form of community supervision where people are serving their sentences in the community? So broadening out to these other forms of punishment and social control in the community.
Amazing, thanks. And I think that leads really nicely into the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is, why is the way that crime and punishment is dealt with so integral to our democracies. I think, like you said, it's kind of a forgotten part of our societies, but in your work, it obviously is very important.
Yeah, so there's this quote attributed to Dostoevsky, which apparently he never said quite literally, but it's become this cliche, right? The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. And so when we think about democratic norms and democratic rule, people who are incarcerated are some of the most vulnerable folks subject to the most extreme forms of state violence and state power and coercion. And so seeing what conditions look like and why and when people are incarcerated and how much transparency there is about that incarceration and the conditions of confinement and the process by which people are held or released is extremely important for understanding, are you in a democracy, and what is the health of that democracy? And I think it gets into some of the things that I think we'll talk about later, but I think saying that it's hidden or disappeared is really important for thinking about too the sort of divides in perception. So for some communities, it's absolutely not hidden. For some communities, this is trauma that is right on the surface, that is part of their day-to-day life, where they know lots of people who have been disappeared. And for some communities, people never think about it, right? And that's actually one of the challenges, which I know we'll get into, of trying to address some of the problems in policing or in our prison systems is the people who are most active in our political system and have the most power are often those that are most removed from the problems and see it the least in their daily lives. And so their perceptions of the problem look really different. And that was true for me when I went into prison for the first time. You know, I grew up relatively economically privileged. My brother had some run-ins with the law, but they had always sort of the police had given him the benefit of the doubt in the way that you would expect for a middle-class white kid in a middle-class neighborhood, right? And so it shocked me, but in retrospect, it shouldn't have, right? And if I had had a different kind of life growing up, it wouldn't have.
Great, thanks. So a lot of our listeners are based in the UK, so they might not have a lot of understanding about the current state of policing in the US. So what are some of the main characteristics, I guess, and problems that are US specific?
So the US is an international outlier in the number of people who are killed by law enforcement every year. And the scale of the difference, I think, when you look at it on the charts, is really shocking to people who come from a European perspective. But in my work, I contextualize those differences to say that we can't put all of that on police as an institution in the United States. Partly that's because we see similar kinds of violence and inequities in policing everywhere, even if the scale is different, right? Violence is just inherent to the role of police in society, but also because violence in general in the United States looks really different than it does, particularly lethal violence, looks really different than it does in other Western democracies. And so the United States is unique for a whole host of reasons, one of which is the massive racial inequality, which is a legacy of slavery, among other things, that just looks really different than in other places. And our lack of a really comprehensive or effective social safety net, the degree to which we expect people to, for instance, find their own healthcare through, often through employment, right? So we have a really weak safety net, really profound both economic and racial inequality, and really profound residential segregation. And all of that together means that we have really unequal rates of lethal violence across different communities. And that is true both for violence in the community and true for violence by the police. So yes, it's true that one of the things that makes policing in the United States unique is just the scale at which we see police violence. But that is actually indicative of broader inequities in our society and exposure to all kinds of violence. Interestingly, the US is really unique for the number of people who are incarcerated, but it is not unique for the scale of our policing. So sometimes people sort of assume that because you have mass incarceration in the US, you have mass policing in the US. It's true that there are some communities that are hyper surveilled and hyper policed, but it is not true that overall the number of local law enforcement is on a per capita ratio a particular outlier in the US. It's not. one of the more radical proposals that people have put out in recent years is actually that the United States might be safer if we had more police but less incarceration, right? And thinking about those two dimensions together, which I don't fully endorse that proposition. I think we need more public safety and less incarceration, and we don't have to do that through more police. But I do appreciate the nuance that the problem of mass incarceration and the problems of policing in the United States are distinct.
Thanks. And I think it's really helpful to make those similarities and comparisons with European or other countries' state of policing as well, especially because I think we might often see US as this outlier, as you say. So if we could get a little bit more into perhaps the more theoretical aspects of your work. So why is over-policing by law enforcement such an issue for democracy?
So there's kind of two layers to the answer to this question. The first is obviously, so over-policing refers to this hyper-surveillance, particularly of urban, poor communities of color. And this idea that people are routinely stopped by police and routinely in their day-to-day lives experience this surveillance and harassment with a risk always of that harassment or that contact leading to violence, including potentially lethal violence. And of course, most police interactions with residents don't end in lethal violence, but there's always that threat. And so the first answer is just if we care about, in a really fundamental principles kind of way, about people's dignity, if we care about people's sense of, that they are entitled to dignified treatment and fair treatment from the state, that kind of over-policing, especially as it's applied unequally across neighborhoods, should alarm us. But the second thing that I think is really corrosive for our democracy more broadly is that when you have this race and class-based system of policing, when I say race and class-based system of policing, I do not mean that, that police departments are explicitly telling their police officers, right, that like this is a system of racial control, but that is in effect what happens because of the ways that the policies are designed, right? And so when you have that kind of system, people of color in poor communities in particular, but people of color generally, they understand correctly that they are being treated differently by the police, right? People understand when they are getting stopped and pulled over in their car and they've done nothing wrong, that they are being pulled over because the police officer spotted them and visually cued, oh, this is maybe somebody that I can harass, right? Whereas white people, and particularly white people with more economic status, when they're pulled over by the police, when they interact with the police, it is often because there was something that happened. They were speeding, they ran a red light. There was sort of a reason for them to be stopped. And so they perceive then that police stop was legitimate, and they perceive their treatment in that stop often as more fair. And so what you get is this bifurcated system of law enforcement that creates bifurcated perspectives where people of color and poor folks understand rightfully that they're being treated as these second-class citizens. And that's really corrosive, right? So if we think about interactions with the state, interactions with law enforcement are a very, very common form of interactions with the state. And so you're immediately getting, for people who are having these differential expectations, this sense of like, oh, I am not a full citizen. And so if you are treated as not a full citizen, what does that mean then for how you think about voting, how you think about engaging with democracy in other ways, how you think about building community power? If every day when you are on the highways, when you are in your car, when you are at a bus stop, you are aware that you are being surveilled and treated differently, right? So it's not only about the individual dignity of people or the dignity of individuals, but it is about these broader erosions of democratic principles.
Great. I really like that point about how you interact with the state, and police are obviously kind of one of the more visible arms of the state that we see. So when you began to write your latest book, The Minneapolis Reckoning, it was before the murder of George Floyd, which I think we can kind of say is a very significant turning point for policing in Minneapolis and in the US more generally. So could you say more about this shift and why the murder of George Floyd was so significant?
Right. So I begun a series of projects. I wasn't sure if it was going to be a book or not. I was it's a professional sidebar. I was in the lead up where I had just gotten tenure. And so it was this beautiful moment in my professional life where I had a little bit more space to do some projects where I wasn't quite sure what was going to come out of them. So around 2016, I just published my first co-authored book, Breaking the Pendulum. And the argument we made in that book was that to really understand how and why criminal justice practices shifted, you had to understand who were the actors at the local, state, and federal levels who were pushing for change. How did they define the problem? What did they think the solutions were? And what kind of power did they have to implement their vision of change? And so as we were finishing that book, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement had exploded across the country. And unlike prisons, which are largely set and run by state level agencies and state level policies, policing in the United States is hyper local. And this may not be obvious to European listeners, is that not only is it that each city, typically for the bigger cities, has their own police departments, but like in Minneapolis, there are multiple police departments. The park system has their own police department. The transit system has their own police department. The city has a police department. The university has a police department. There's also county sheriffs and the state force. So there are over 17,000 police departments across the country. It's hyper local. And so I really wanted to understand, how does this process of political contestation around punishment look different when we're focused on this like hyper local intervention, and what are the levers of power and who controls them at that city level for city policing? And so I just started poking around. I started interviewing people who were organizing on the ground. We already had some pretty significant BLM protests and organizing happening by the time we get to 2016. I started talking to journalists who covered the policing beat. I started talking to reformers who were doing police reform work at various agencies that were active in Minneapolis. And I had a student who had a summer fellowship, and I said, who wanted to work on policing. I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I have been myself been held at gunpoint by law enforcement. I want to understand how the communities that are most impacted by policing are responding to this moment. And so that really launched a whole different data collection effort that was about interviews with folks in North Minneapolis that a number of students of mine joined on to. And so for years, I was just sort of slowly collecting data, getting both the kind of neighborhood perspective of this national conversation, which periodically was focused on Minneapolis and the surrounding Twin Cities, and then also talking to people who were trying to make change in the local field. And by 2019, I had wrapped those projects. It felt like we call it theoretical saturation in qualitative research. It felt like people were telling me the same things that they had been telling me, and that we had sort of gotten to a good pausing point. And so when George Floyd was murdered, I have drafts of this academic work where we're trying to make the case of why Minneapolis is a really important case. And suddenly Minneapolis was in the spotlight. We actually had a team meeting, my students and I, scheduled for the day after George Floyd was murdered. He was murdered at an intersection where there was a coffee shop that I had written parts of the project just working at that coffee shop. I mean, it was very intimate. It was in our backyard, so to speak. And what I realized when George Floyd was murdered, at the time I had sort of decided not to write a book from this project, and was just doing a series of articles with the students that were on the project, in part because more books had come out on the BLM movement. And I wasn't sure exactly what this case had to add to the conversation. And when George Floyd was murdered, it became tragically clear that all of the data and the knowledge from the community that we'd gathered in those early years became preamble to this story I didn't know that I was telling about why Minneapolis erupted with rage, but also what followed. And so I then launched a whole new data collection effort, trying to understand in the several years after the killing up to about 2023, I was sort of like updating chapters as the book went to press for 2024 publication. I was trying to map out what were the consequences of this moment of rupture, these massive protests. And one of the important things to recognize is that, it was hard to stop in 2023. And you might say, oh, well, that's 3 years after the murder, right? Shouldn't we have had some sense of what was going to come 3 years after the murder? But one of the important findings from the back half of the book is just the really slow pace of change, and that we need to think about this in terms of years and even decades of struggle, and not as these kind of quick fixes and point in time.
Amazing, thanks. And you obviously mentioned there the kind of really slow pace that the change can happen over, and I think part of the slogans that were popular around the time that George Floyd was murdered, one of those was defund the police, and I think that became very popular both in the US and around the world. I know that it was used quite heavily in BLM protests in the UK, for example. So what does this call kind of mean in practice, especially in kind of because of this slow change and the fact that we can't just simply defund the police straight away?
Yeah. So, defund the police, I think, is one of the most misunderstood political slogans in recent history. And what's really tragic about how the public conversation has evolved on this is that if you actually talk to organizers, if you actually are really deep in the movement and you understand what defund was meant to do, there are versions of it that are actually wildly popular. And so the same everyday voters who might say, oh, defund the campaign, that was too radical, I really dislike that slogan, are actually the same people who would say yes to differently phrased survey questions that did not use that slogan. And so it meant different things to different people. But so to unpack that, I think, defund the police was meant as this rallying cry to first recognize that police contact always carries the risk of lethal violence. And, I am not somebody who thinks that we cannot reform the police. I think there can and has been meaningful reform efforts that can reduce the rate of lethal police violence, particularly in these kinds of ambiguous contexts or unambiguously unjustified contexts that produce the most public outrage. I think you can make changes there, but they're incremental changes, and they're changes that are never going to eliminate the risk to zero, right? Fundamentally, if part of the role of police is to use violence, is to enact arrests when people do not want to be arrested, and sometimes to kill somebody who is presenting a lethal risk to other folks in that immediate moment, that is always going to be part of their job. And you are never going to get to a system of policing where we have perfectly honed that so that there are never any mistakes and only the quote unquote right people are killed in the right context, right? Like that is a utopian vision in some ways, that we could get to that perfect spot. It will always carry the risk of violence. So that was number one. Policing always carries the risk of violence. Okay, so if you start from that perspective, why in the world would you have police be the default responders to a series of crises in urban, but also rural and suburban places where the threat of violence is not the most appropriate response, right? In mental health crises, in low-level neighborhood disputes, in property violence reports. Like in all of these cases, there are other folks that we could send, and there are other kinds of approaches to reduce those harms in society that don't involve the police. And that was really the core of the defund idea that I think got misrepresented in a lot of popular discourses. I think it got associated with abolish police, and certainly there were lots of folks who were abolitionists who saw defund as a route to abolition, but it was always meant to be a process, not an immediate overnight. And it was meant to be a process of building up these alternative public safety models. And if you ask Americans, do you support like building up, for instance, support for mental health responses outside of policing in response to 911 calls? That's a very popular idea in the United States. So this idea that we could slowly replace police with other kinds of institutions, which was the core of the defund. It wasn't just let's take away money from the police and do nothing with it or light it on fire. It was let's take these investments that we're making in police, which always carry the risk of violence, and see if we can use that money better in other kinds of interventions for people. And because you have this kind of knee-jerk support for law enforcement, particularly among white Americans, again, because of those differential experiences with law enforcement in their lives and the lives of the people close to them and their family members, it was really hard for that message not to be demonized and villainized and pushed to kind of the fringes, even though the kind of core demand, I think, was not only reasonable, but politically popular.
Great. And you mentioned there the kind of decades of organising within Minneapolis. And their organising did almost culminate in the abolition of the Minneapolis Police Department. So what does this tell us about the kind of the power, I guess, of local politics and these important slogans that people are using?
Yeah. So there's sort of two answers to that. One is just like it was really complicated and nuanced what exactly defund meant, and the devil was in the details, as the cliche goes. The same was true for this campaign in Minneapolis. So it was framed in the political discourse, particularly on the right, but also in some of the left-leaning spaces, as abolishing the Minneapolis Police Department. But what that 2021 charter amendment would have done was a much more technocratic change that would have strucken out all of the details about the MPD, which was a guaranteed department in the city charter. And it would have instead written in a new Department of Public Safety, which would have included law enforcement as one of the subdivisions, right? So that gets read as like, oh, the end of the MPD. And in a technical sense, that was true. The MPD as it existed would not have existed had that ballot initiative passed. But in a more practical sense, the most likely outcome of that ballot initiative, had it passed, would have been that the MPD would have just gotten folded into this other department as a unit and then reorganized and re-understood. But it would still fundamentally look a lot like the MPD, at least in the immediate aftermath. And there would have then been an opening to create further changes down the line. But in the immediate aftermath, it would have looked a lot like what we got. And in fact, the mayor promised to create a new department that would bring together these public safety functions before that vote. And it has followed through on that campaign promise. And so that kind of reorganization did actually happen in Minneapolis. And it was essentially an administrative reorganization where the MPD continues to stand, but now has this like added layer of administration that brings in some of the other public safety initiatives and some new experiments in under that same, under one umbrella. So on the one hand, the MPD was never really going to be abolished in a practical sense, even if you would see the end of the department as we knew it to create this new organization. But I do think that all of that is not to undercut, I think, what was a profoundly powerful political moment and political challenge in Minneapolis, and a profound political challenge to the legitimacy of law enforcement in the United States in that summer of 2020. And I think, for people who weren't super plugged into this work, I was doing these interviews with activists and organizers, as I said, from 2017 to 2019. And I actually wound up changing my interview questions as I went, in part to start talking about abolition, because I could see how that was growing in importance in Minneapolis. I saw what eventually I understood as kind of sowing these seeds that would bloom in summer 2020. And so for people who were plugged in, the sort of slow build of abolition was there. But even for people like me who were really on the ground with this work, or at least studying it, I don't think anyone could have predicted that we were going to see, New York Times op-eds from Miriam Kaba saying, yes, we really mean abolish the police. I mean, the scale at which abolitionist discourses went mainstream for even a short period of time was truly remarkable, right? And we've since seen a real retrenchment and a backlash to that moment. But I think, when I talk to my undergraduate students in my classes, people who are coming of political age in this moment where abolish the police is as a slogan they've heard of, is really a remarkable political development. And I think remains to be seen how that ultimately will play out. But certainly among the political left in the United States, there has been this real shift in opinion about law enforcement that would not have been true had we not seen these massive protests starting in Minneapolis and then spreading around not only the country, but the world in 2020.
We kind of couldn't talk about local law enforcement activity in Minneapolis without also talking about the recent events. So obviously the focus of the world has been on Minneapolis once again because of the killings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty. And they are, of course, different political contexts and different agencies involved. But how has the previous community response in Minneapolis kind of prepared the city to respond to these events?
Yeah, so, it's been a really tough couple of months, obviously, locally, but also really incredible to see the community solidarity and the neighbors standing up for neighbors, right? Even in the face of lethal law enforcement violence against people who are not typically the subject of that kind of violence and are not the target of the Department of Homeland Security typically, right? So you have two white residents who were killed, not as protesters, as it's often being framed in the media, but who were standing up and trying to support and protect and defend their neighbors by witnessing what was happening here on the streets of Minneapolis. So, I don't think, we can't go back in time. We don't have a time machine. There's no counterfactuals in real life. But I don't think you would see the scale and the degree of organization and mobilization in Minneapolis had it not been for the muscle building of summer of 2020, right? So we're seeing the same community networks, the same organizers in some cases, this muscle memory of mutual aid, the muscle memory of showing up and protesting. And we're also seeing some really new developments, which are, had been piloted in other cities like Chicago and Los Angeles, but have been really built on and expanded in Minneapolis. We're seeing citizens running patrols of their neighborhoods. We're seeing dispatch units to deploy neighbors to go to where there are ICE sightings or Customs and Border Patrol sightings across the city and in St. Paul and in other places across Minnesota. You're seeing these signal channels emerge of rapid communication. And that all, the degree of that organization and how long people have been able to sustain it is really remarkable. And the degree to which it's pulled in just everyday residents and parents, patrolling their kids' schools. It's hard to imagine that that scale of response would look the same had it not been for the lessons of 2020. And you could see it too in the kind of immediate aftermath of Renee Macklin Good's killing. There was immediate distrust of the law enforcement narrative from the federal government, which was warranted because, in fact, the initial description was wildly misleading. And so there was initial, you have to see it on video, right? There was an initial do not trust, the first thing that comes out of this agency's mouth. And, what's been really remarkable is just the incredible solidarity in Minneapolis and across, from the people on the streets to community organizers to the mayor to the governor of Minnesota. In part, I think that unity is easier to sustain this time because the agency that's committed the harm is this federal agency that is really feeling like an invading force and an occupying force. And that is easier to create this kind of unified sense of resistance, right? Because the mayor, for instance, is not implicated in this as overseeing the police department as he would have been if it were the MPD. And that also means because it's this federal occupation and in the name of immigration enforcement, but of course in practice seems to be wildly disconnected from anything related to either real law enforcement or real immigration enforcement, but instead just seems to be this political repression of Minneapolis and this political retribution. You've seen just this incredibly radical shift, right? Where you see the mayor saying, to ICE, get the fuck out of the city, right? And so what seemed, again, unthinkable in 2020, this abolish police, is now like abolish ICE, abolish DHS is becoming, at least in Minneapolis, a pretty mainstream position. And in part because it's easier to imagine a world in which federal agents are not occupying our streets, because before 2 months ago, they were not, in fact, occupying our streets, right? That there is no actual reason or justification or legitimacy to this act. So yeah, I think what's happening today is Minneapolis finds itself again at the center of the kind of political resistance and political discussion about law enforcement. But I don't think it's a mistake or a mistake. I don't think it's chance that it was Minneapolis again. I think the two are connected, and in part because the president wanted to recreate 2020 and wanted to punish Minnesota and Minneapolis. Like, it's literally a reprisal of 2020 that we're seeing that unprecedented surge happen here. But I also think it's no mistake that it was Minneapolis, in the sense that people were prepared for this in a way that might not have been true in other places.
Amazing, thank you. And I think that's a really important point for us to end on there. We do like to ask a few quick fire questions towards the end of the episode to kind of sum up what we've spoken about and some key takeaway points for our listeners. So the first question that I had for you was, what gives you hope or concern for when we look into the future of policing?
I'm going to choose hope because it's a grim time and there's a lot of cause for concern. So we're going to go with hope. And I'm just going to pick up on what we were just talking about to say that the way that neighbors have shown up for one another in Minneapolis, but also St. Paul and across the country, and it's just been remarkable to witness. And I want to give a particular shout out. I'm a mom, and I have long joked that if you want to get shit done, like, call your mom friends. And the degree to which mom networks have been mobilized in this moment has been really incredible and beautiful to witness that solidarity.
Thanks. That is a lovely, hopeful point there. What's the biggest obstacle, do you think, to police reform?
I think the biggest obstacle to police reform is that there is no sort of one quick fix to solve the problems in policing. They're deep and structural and embedded. And we have to change society, not just change policing, to fundamentally address these issues. And no reform ultimately is going to get entirely remove the risk of lethal violence from the role of policing. And so our goal really shouldn't be reform. Our goal should be to think about, how do we transform society? How do we rein in police violence as much as we can? And how do we build alternative models that create real safety in communities outside of policing?
And where do you see the biggest gap between public expectations and the reality of policing?
I think law enforcement often say that the biggest problem is that the public doesn't understand their job and doesn't understand how dangerous their job is. And while I'm sometimes critical of that framing because it's often used to justify police violence, I think it is actually true that if the public knew more about what police officers do day in, day out, they wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that would legitimize policing. I think that would reinforce people's sense that there has to be a better way to do this, right? And I think it is actually true that most Americans, I think, would find it eye-opening to do a ride-along with law enforcement. But what I often see when I do those ride-alongs is that they are responding to the crises of poverty that they did not create and have few tools to solve, right? So again, I think learning more isn't about sort of justifying police activities, but rather understanding the real challenges in our neighborhoods that more privileged folks often don't see, and kind of the scale of change needed.
And what's one thing you'd like our listeners to understand about the relationship between policing and democracy?
Just because we're sitting in this moment, the immigration enforcement, which I don't think is actually immigration enforcement, but that is a kind of banner understanding, this federal occupation of Minneapolis today While that's not my specific research expertise, I think it's clear enough to say that this is a profound challenge to democratic norms, that there is massive sliding towards authoritarianism happening right now in the United States. The fact that we have masked, heavily armed, unidentified federal law enforcement flooding our streets and essentially stopping people with brown skin or accents indiscriminately and whisking them away to detention centers that are wildly non-transparent, where you can't tell who's locked up where or what the conditions there are. All of these should be massive red flags to people that we are not, these are not like warning signs. These are, we have left the democratic, democracy is always a sort of sliding scale. It is not a yes or no. But we were never, the United States was certainly never a perfect perfect democracy, and our policing abuses were one indicator of that. But we have already wildly departed from the already inadequate norms of previous administrations, even the first Trump administration, in ways that are deeply, deeply concerning and should should be a warning bell to everybody, whether you are undocumented, documented, citizen, not white, non-white. Everybody should be deeply concerned with the abuses of state power we're seeing across the country right now.
And I think that perhaps leads really nicely onto the final question that I have for you, which is, given everything that we've discussed today, what is one thing democracy should do differently?
Yeah, it's so tough answering this question in this moment where we're still under siege in Minneapolis. Maybe seeing the beginning of the end, we'll see. But I am heartened by research that shows that places that had democratic backsliding, that can be reversed. And I think that has to be the path that we strive towards, whether we're successful or not. Right? There's beauty in the doing of the work for the right reasons. And so I would say what we need to do in a very global sense is to build our capacity for better, richer, truer, deeper conversations about the problems in the United States, and figure out how to build policy responses that really honor the inherent dignity and value of everybody's lives, right? And make a difference and support community vitality and human thriving.
Thanks. I think that's such an inspiring note for us to end on. So thank you, Michelle, for a really lovely conversation today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And thanks, of course, to all of our listeners for tuning in today. If you've enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much for tuning in.